Pennsylvania Avenue was a sea of mud and standing water on March 4th, 1865, when President Abraham Lincoln stood beneath the east portico of the Capitol to deliver his second inaugural address. Tens of thousands of people stood in the inclement weather to celebrate his inauguration. Lee's surrender at Appomattox was more than a month away, but on that wet Saturday in March, everyone knew the South had lost the war. Lincoln had won re-election in an electoral landslide, although the popular vote was close. The Confederate States, of course, did not participate in the election. The weather on that March day very much reflected the mood of the country. Enmity and economic distress hung over the states like storm clouds. We were a profoundly divided nation. At this consequential moment, President Lincoln understood that we were not a nation divided over anything as pedestrian as slavery. Lincoln believed that we were divided about matters of faith. During the course of his presidency, Lincoln came to see events in the context of a great divide that bordered on the religious. This is the background to his second inaugural address. Lincoln's second inaugural address is fittingly his second most famous speech after the Gettysburg Address. But it is certainly as consequential as the Gettysburg Address, perhaps more so. The second inaugural address, along with the Gettysburg Address, is inscribed in the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., proving that fewer words are always better. The second inaugural address of Abraham Lincoln is merely 700 words. It merits reading in its entirety. At this second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. Then, a statement somewhat in detail of a course to be pursued seemed fitting and proper. Now, at the expiration of 4 years, during which public declarations have been constantly called forth on every point and phase of the great contest which still absorbs the attention and engrosses the energies of this nation, little that is new could be presented. The progress of our arms, upon which all else chiefly depends, is as well known to the public as to myself, and it is, I trust, reasonably satisfactory and encouraging to all. With high hope for the future, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish, and the war came. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union even by war. while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. But woe to the man by whom that offenses cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove. And that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure for those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and altogether just. With malice toward none and charity toward all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Lincoln's second inaugural address might seem a peculiar touchstone for a sermon on Yom Kippur. But in fact, of all the nation's presidents, Abraham Lincoln is probably the most appropriate to invite into our synagogue. Because as much as Lincoln was the president of the United States, he was the preacher of the United States. His orations relied heavily on biblical references and quotes. His second inaugural address is the finest example of this. And this was in an era during which many listeners would be able to cite the chapter and verse of each reference. Lincoln was drawn to theology and to the role of God not only in his own life and presidency, but in the life of the United States of America. The weight of divine providence rested wearily upon his shoulders. He sensed the hand of God in the Civil War, but he was quite unsure of whose side it touched. In a way, as a leader, Lincoln was closer to Dr. Martin Luther King than any other modern president. Lincoln's second inaugural address spoke to a core value woven into the fabric of the United States uniquely among the nations: the role of faith in the public sphere. One need not be a particularly acute political observer to see the resonance of that issue in our own time. In the political environment of today, Lincoln could not pass a religious test. Lincoln was by no means hostile to religion. He was interested in religion and its spirituality. Yet, on at least one occasion, in writing, he denied that he was a Christian, or even a member of any organized religion, something that today would essentially disqualify a member of either party as a candidate for president. His close associates, such as Ward Lamon and William Herndon, flatly denied that Lincoln was a Christian. Lincoln clearly maintained a complex relationship with God that may well have included agnosticism or atheism for long stretches of time, but during his presidency, his own writings and speeches clearly reflect a preoccupation with divine providence. Whatever Lincoln believed, whatever God Lincoln worshipped or denied, this is true. Lincoln was a man of faith. Virtually all scholars agree that Lincoln's second inaugural address was his most articulate declaration of faith, yet there is virtually no agreement about the precise nature of Lincoln's faith. If we apply the same textual analysis we as Jews apply so meaningfully to our own sacred texts, we can begin to tease out Lincoln's meaning and see its relevance for our own times. After making it clear that the progress of the war was reasonably satisfactory, Lincoln concluded the first paragraph of his oration with these words: "With high hope for the future, no prediction in regard to it is ventured." This is a clear statement of Lincoln's faith. God has a plan. We do not know what it is or how it will unfold, but the very nature of faith is to believe that tomorrow will be better than today. Lincoln then goes on to apportion blame for the war in a rather genteel, but not altogether balanced manner, on both the North and the South. Then Lincoln arrives at the central point of his address. Both the North and the South read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. Lincoln reminds us that both the North and the South believed that God was on their side. Both the North and the South asked God's aid against the other. Then Lincoln offers a stinging rebuke to both sides. You cannot possibly understand God's plan. Do not believe, says Lincoln, that the outcome of the war is in any manner proof that God sides with either the victor or the vanquished. The Almighty, says Lincoln, has his own purposes. Although neither was aware, Lincoln and Rabbi Soloveitchik shared a vision of faith. And that vision of faith is modern, inspirational, and uniquely suited to our contemporary world. As I discussed last night, the Rav, as Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik is known, suggested that faith is the ability of one human to enter into another existential relationship with another person. There is another part of Soloveitchik's faith, however. I enter into a relationship of faith with another human being. Then the two of us enter into a relationship of faith with a community. For Soloveitchik, the highest ideal was to enter into a community of faith bound together by transcendent ideas, principles, and beliefs. This community of faith is the faith of Abraham Lincoln, and a faith well suited to the modern world. The nation that President Lincoln led was a nation torn asunder by a fervent belief that God was on my side. The North believed this, and the South believed this. Yet as Lincoln argued so eloquently in his second inaugural address, that could not possibly be true. God could not be on the side of the North and the South. God could not possibly be in favor of slavery and opposed to slavery. And moreover, Lincoln knew well that the Bible permitted slavery. So Lincoln rescued faith from God and from the Bible. Lincoln made the point that neither the North nor the South really knows God's ways. The war and its outcome offered no insight into God. The war and its outcome did not prove God was on either side. Could it possibly be that God sanctioned the death of more than 600,000 men? So rather than argue about God, or even about faith in a particular God, Lincoln argued for faith in a noble cause greater than even two individuals. Lincoln argued, precisely as Soloveitchik did almost 100 years later, that we needed to have faith not merely in each other, but in the idea of something greater, and for Lincoln it was this great country. Lincoln wanted us to enter into a community of faith based not on sectarian faith, but on the relational faith described by Soloveitchik. To cast this in terms from last night, Lincoln believed that the antidote to the existential loneliness of Soloveitchik was a community of faith in which you and I together believe we are greater than our individual selves. If Lincoln were alive today, he would be appalled at the bastardization of faith in the modern world. He would cringe upon hearing about Muslims who rage against those they perceive as infidels. But he would also cringe upon hearing that Christians want to use their faith to bludgeon women's rights. This was not how President Lincoln understood faith. And it was not how Soloveitchik understood communal faith. And it is not how we, in 2012, should understand faith. Lincoln understood faith as a great healing force in the world, not a great divisive force. Lincoln had faith in humanity, but also, more importantly, in the ability of humanity to transcend itself. And in fact, Lincoln would have nothing but disdain for the sectarian faith of marauding Muslims or the self-righteous Christians or Jews so obsessed with Jewish law they have lost sight of Judaism. The only use of faith in the public sphere ought to be to unite human beings. The only purpose of faith in the public sphere ought to be to elevate the human spirit and bring one human closer to another in a manner that transcends their sectarian beliefs. This is what Lincoln believed. This is what I believe. The country that Lincoln led was complicated enough. And that was a country in which, for all practical purposes, everyone was a Christian. And the only religious minority to speak of were Jews. Even in that homogeneous environment, Lincoln rejected sectarian notions of faith. How can it be today, in a country with more Muslims than Jews and more Hispanics than Muslims, we have allowed sectarian faith to gain such a strong and nefarious foothold in the public sphere? How can it possibly be that in our country today, faith more often divides than unites? I see faith used as a hammer to beat the faith of another into submission. I see today faith as a zero-sum game. My faith must prevail in its entirety. Lincoln's great achievement in his second inaugural address was to allow the faith of both the North and the South to coexist. A stunning model for our own day that has sadly been cast aside. Lincoln, in many ways foreshadowing Soloveitchik, allowed two individuals, the North and the South, to enter into a relationship and find their way towards something greater, the cause of the Union. That the relationship of the North and the South was broken, damaged, and barely breathing made his accomplishment all the more profound. Would that there was a leader among us able to do today what Lincoln did then. As I argued last night, faith is our ability to enter into relationships. We first enter into a relationship with another individual. Then, two individuals enter into a relationship with others of faith in a faith community that is greater than the sum of its parts. For Soloveitchik, this is the most sublime form of faith, the faith to which all humans inherently aspire. This is the faith that can catapult us out of our loneliness. This is the faith all humans seek. Can it be that this kind of redemption is less likely in our world today than it was upon the conclusion of the Civil War? Can it be that today that which divides us creates a wider chasm than that between the North and the South? Why is it today that there is not a single leader able to do for us what Lincoln did for America more than 150 years ago? I do not see too many expressions of faith in the public sphere that meet what I'll call the Lincoln test. This would be an expression of faith that includes rather than excludes. This would be an expression of faith that unites rather than divides. This would be an expression of faith that brings out the best in the human spirit rather than our most base human instincts. I yearn to see this faith in the public sphere. I yearn to wake up one morning and see a faith I recognize in the public sphere, a faith best summarized in the closing paragraph of President Lincoln's second inaugural address. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations.